بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وآله. Many thanks indeed. It's really always a great pleasure to be here in Malaysia. I feel fully Malay except that I don't speak Malaysian. No. I should probably give it some time, some effort. Now let me tell you a story that is not in the book and that probably none of you heard it from me before. Where this started, how did it start, all of this? When I went to the UK for the second time, the first time was in the 70s when I did my A-levels and I knew some troublemakers there and became friends with them. But the second time was in 1991, toward the end of 1991. And that was right at the time of the Algerian elections. Those of you who are old enough to remember, there was an election in Algeria in December 1991, the first round, and then just before the second round was supposed to take place in January 1992, the army intervened and cancelled the democratic process. And that led to mayhem, and in less than a decade, nearly 250,000 Algerians lost their lives. And this is what happens when people are denied democracy. Now in early 1992, I set up a group called Friends of Democracy in Algeria to enlighten and alert the British public about the gravity of what happened in Algeria. I needed to stay in Britain, so one of my friends suggested, why don't you apply for a PhD and then get a student visa so as to be able to do your lobbying. So I started applying to universities. I wrote a couple of pages explaining that I was interested in investigating Islam and democracy. Never received a reply except from one university. The university I received a reply from was the University of Westminster. And it was a personal reply from Professor John Keane, the director of the Center for the Study of Democracy at the university. He said to me in the letter, "Dear Azzam, I don't know how your letter arrived at my desk. But I'm really curious, what has Islam got to do with democracy? Come, I want to see you. Can you come to my house?" He left his telephone number, I called him, and he said, "Come immediately." So I went, he wasn't far. I was in Cricklewood, he was in Kentish Town, so not far away. He said, "I'm busy today, I just have half an hour, I just want to understand what is it that you are talking about." And our meeting lasted 3 hours. Toward the end of the meeting, he said, "Azzam," this is the way he usually addressed me, "Azzam," now he's in Australia. "Apparently I know nothing about Islam. And clearly you know very little about Western thought. So what about this? From now on you are my teacher about Islam and I am your teacher about Western thoughts." And that was the beginning of my PhD thesis, supervised by John Keane. We started in the beginning by investigating whether Islam and democracy were compatible. Soon we moved to proving that secularism was actually incompatible with democracy. And we organized a conference in 1994 that was then published in a book edited by me and John Esposito called Islam and Secularism in the Middle East. John Keane by then became convinced that the real problem is with secularism and not with Islam. I introduced Rachid Ghannouchi to him, invited Rachid Ghannouchi to our center, the Center for the Study of Democracy, to present a paper about Islam and the West. And John Keane took me in the afternoon to a cafe shop near the university and said to me, "Azzam, if you want to do a thesis that people would love to read as a book and will immediately be published, then let's change the topic to Rachid Ghannouchi. He was so impressed by Rachid Ghannouchi. A clever, innovative person with deep analysis. Let's do Islam and democracy, but through the thinking of Rachid Ghannouchi. And let me tell you a secret. By that time, Rachid Ghannouchi had not written a word about civil society or secularism. It was my questions to him about civil society and secularism that brought out of him the treasure of ideas. This is a man who has the ability to generate ideas when you present him with a problem. Lucky for me, that resulted in a good book. I hope you agree with me that it's a good book once you've read the Malay translation. Now, Rachid Ghannouchi in my book is the Rachid Ghannouchi who led the Islamists in insisting that democracy and Islam were fully compatible. In my book, I argue, through the thinking of Rachid Ghannouchi, which I managed to get out of him through hundreds of hours of discussions, which are all recorded, I have them on record, that democracy in the Arab world, and I dare say even in the Muslim world, is hindered primarily not by Islam or the Islamists. It is hindered primarily by the world order, which hates to see democratization in our part of the world, because democratization of our systems will mean less corruption, will mean more accountability, will mean more empowerment of the human being in our countries, more independence of the former colonial powers that continue to have so much influence on our lives, whether we like it or not. Then there is the modern territorial state. I don't call it a nation state because in the European case it was a nation state. In the case of the Arab world and probably many parts of the Muslim world, it is a territorial state because its boundaries were drawn by colonial powers, and it was not really representative of an entity that had a unique identity compared to its neighbors. That territorial state is so resistant to democratization in its shape because once democratization succeeds, the borders would fall. And that's what the Arab Spring promised. The Arab Spring, had it succeeded in Tunisia and Libya, I was sure that soon the borders between the two countries would be removed from those sands. Egypt and Libya, the same thing. Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, one country, one people, one past, and most probably one future. Those lines drawn in the sand by Sykes-Picot and those who came after them are all artificial, and the territorial state created by colonial powers is resistant to democratization because democratization is a threat to this division within our own ummah. Then there is secularism. Secularism did not come to the Muslim world through natural evolution. It wasn't a revolution like in Europe against despotism, against a church that in the name of the divine oppressed the people and persecuted them. Secularism or secularization in the Western history, in the European history, is fully understandable. And it resulted in liberal democracy in many of those countries, in progress, in success. But in our case, secularism came to us on the colonial tank. It came to us through colonial authorities that destroyed our societies, destroyed the traditional endowment or awqaf institution that for more than 1,000 years was independent of political authority and funded independent schools and universities to which people came from all over the world to seek knowledge. Secularism as is imposed in much of the Muslim world, is an imported, deformed commodity that has sought to diminish and to minimize the role of Islam in our lives under the pretext that religion causes backwardness. That's not the case in our history. In our history, we were glorious, we were great, we were successful when we abided by the values of our religion. But when we gave up those values and ran after imported, deformed commodities, we lost all the glory and we lost all the respect our ancestors one day had. Then there is the problem of civil society, and there is a chapter in the book about civil society. What does civil society mean? How it evolved? What is the story? And how the term was used throughout the 60s, the 70s and the 80s and part of the 90s in order to deny Islamic organizations the designation of civil society institutions. The purpose was to exclude them from political process, to exclude them from legality. What you will find in this book is a message to the world. First, that democracy in the present time is a solution to our problems. But democracy has to evolve through our own thinking. It cannot be a cut and paste thing. And that's why we believe we can generate a form of democracy that is different from liberal democracy. But there is no harm in beginning with what we have. And what we have is a system consisting of two components. And it is the procedural component that we need to focus on and develop. As for the ideological component, that was the product of a certain context, and it would be a crime against humanity and a crime against our own culture and religion to import it as it is. And here I mean liberalism. Now today, after the Arab Spring has suffered as a result of the plot against it by powers that felt threatened by its success, and I mean here Israel, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, who today form a coalition among themselves. Within Islamic ranks, there is a lot of confusion. Like the question, can an Islamist be a Democrat? Actually, this question should never be asked. Because Rachid Ghannouchi is an example. A Democrat within Islamism. When I wrote about Rachid Ghannouchi, he was a leading Islamist. And I defended his ideas as a Democrat. The thesis of the book is that there is no incompatibility between being an Islamist and being a Democrat. But let's ask a simple question. I know our sister gave a brief definition of what an Islamist is in her introduction, but what do we mean by an Islamist? Is it a negative term or a positive term? When you hear someone say, this person is an Islamist, what feeling do you get? There was a time that it didn't really matter much if people called us Islamists. But today, many of us feel uneasy. And they prefer to call themselves something else. I'd say call yourself whatever you like. It doesn't matter. What matters is what you carry of ideas. And the idea a Muslim carries is that we have a mission in life. Of course, there are Muslims who don't carry a mission. That's their choice. They are lazy Muslims. We need to encourage them to be less lazy, to be more involved. But a Muslim, a pious Muslim, is one who knows that he or she one day will meet their Lord. And this life is only a passage. It's a passage toward Al-Akhirah. We are not just any creatures. We are not any human beings. We are people who have a message. وَالْمُؤْمِنُونَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتُ بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. Believing men and believing women They form a unity among themselves. They enjoin the good and forbid the evil. What does it mean to enjoin the good and forbid the evil? It means to be active. It means to be concerned. It means to be interested. It means to be involved. You cannot be a Muslim sitting on the peripheries. That's a lazy Muslim. I don't deny you the designation of a Muslim. You are a Muslim since you say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. But I'd say to you, be careful, brother. Be careful, sister. This is not what you are supposed to be. You are supposed to be involved. What do we do about corruption in our society? What do we do about injustice? What do we do about the oppression of our brothers and sisters around the world? What do we do about someone like Trump and his lackeys, Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed, who are destroying the ummah left and right? Are we to be indifferent? Or are we to do something about it? The moment you want to do something about it, you are a political person. You are an active person. Does that mean you are an Islamist? By all means, I am an Islamist. I'm not ashamed of being an Islamist. A member of the Muslim Brotherhood, the greatest movement in modern history, that seeks to change the world to the better. And that's why they collaborated against our brother Dr. Muhammad Mursi when he made the slogan, we will not progress until we make our food, we make our medicine, and we make our weapons. Why should we remain lackeys, dependent on left and right? I mean, you just need to, once this is over, search for the recent declaration between Saudi Arabia and Britain following the visit of Mohammed bin Salman to Britain. Neo-colonialism. Once more, Saudi Arabia is a British colony. And now he's going to Washington. He will also hand Saudi Arabia to the Americans. Saudi Arabia has had oil for nearly 100 years. And until today, they cannot be independent in education. They cannot be independent in health. They cannot be independent in anything. Why? Because the people of Saudi Arabia have no choice. They cannot go to a polling station. They cannot vote. They cannot choose their leaders. We need to struggle for democracy, but we need to struggle from within the house of Islam. And never ever be ashamed about being a Muslim and a committed Muslim. Wassalamu alaikum.